When I was in seminary, I took lots of theology classes, as you can imagine. One in particular was called Theology in Black and Brown, an examination of African American and Latinx theological thought. The class was academic theologians who happened to be best friends. Dr. Anthony Pinn, a humanist from Rice University, and Dr. Benjamin Valentine, a Catholic from Yale Divinity School. During the class, they would each do mini lectures on their respective fields and topics, then engage in conversation on selected themes before opening the discussion for questions from us students. It was unlike any other theology class many of us had ever taken. Confused, we asked, "What is theology?" Their inability to agree on a definition was such a relief. Because I had been struggling with that definition myself for the whole time I was in seminary. And I know that we traditionally think of theology as the study of God, but that definition didn't work for me, especially in a Unitarian Universalist context where so many people don't believe in a God. That just wasn't broad enough for me. I decided on my own that religion is that collection of values and convictions by which we live our lives, and that theology is the process of identifying those values and convictions. Was I close, I wondered. Dr. Valentine described theology as the criticism and caretaking of a particular religious tradition. Okay. He said it implies an interest in the continuation of that religion and includes interpreting, reassessing expression in light of our current reality. Dr. Pinn's definition was much shorter and broader. To him, theology was a tool. It was a way of naming, investigating, and interrogating the way we wrestle with human experience. He is an incredibly gifted theologian and academician, and then there were a whole lot of words after that none of us understood. But he concluded it with saying, theology is about bodies moving through time and space. So it seems, after all, I wasn't that far off with my definition. Theology isn't a what, it's a how. I could work with this. This was okay. As both professors noticed, it's about thinking, reassessing, re-examining, reassessing, and thinking. But thinking, examining, and reassessing what? When we think of traditional theological study, theology is an examination of our entire existence, our history, our church experience, art, music, and literature, even our daily interactions with each other and with nature. Our culture is an important source of theological exploration, or as Dr. Pinn describes it, religious cartography. It's a less Christian-specific presentation of material. It's an arranging and fixing in time and space of the contours and roots, of meaning-making. So this year, we're going to have several services on religious cartography. We'll talk about the meaning of making, or the way of making meaning through this, through bicycling, through other spiritual practices. But today we're going to start with the theology of poetry. In particular, the poetry of Paul Laurence Dunbar, author of my favorite poem, Mystery. I know what that poem means to me, but I wanted to better understand his theology, his understanding of the world, and how he moved through it. So I want to share with you what I discovered, but first I need to tell you a little bit about the man and his times. Enslaved persons who moved from Kentucky to Ohio. His father died when he was very young. Academically gifted, he published his first book of poetry while he was still in high school. He aspired to be a lawyer, but due to his family's financial situation, instead worked as an elevator operator. He continued to write and achieved much notoriety as his poetry became more widely read by blacks and whites alike. One of his most famous poems, Sympathy, contains the line, "I know why the caged bird sings." That's who he is. Dunbar wrote both in standard English and in black dialect, a fact that would cause some white readers to stereotype him and underestimate his literary ability. A critic writing in the 1950s said, "For the most part, his militant racial poems appear to be designed for propaganda of aspiration. Stereotyped in praise and conventional in phraseology, Dunbar's poems are marked by a superficial action of the times." It also caused some African American readers to criticize him for pandering to whites or even mocking the experience of those who had been enslaved. But despite the conflict, Dunbar said to his friend and fellow writer James Weldon Johnson, "I've got to write dialect poetry. It's the only way I can get them to listen to me." Dunbar struggled financially and physically most of his life, dying of tuberculosis and the effects of alcohol abuse at the young age of 33. Yet in his short life, he left us much to study. Indeed, our nation was in the midst of dramatic change during his lifetime, 1872 to 1906. What the world was like. When he published his first book of poetry, the Emancipation Proclamation was barely 25 years old. Immediately during Reconstruction, African Americans, or Negroes as we were called then, began to step into the mainstream of society. During the period 1867 to 1914, we began venturing out of the South and settling in the northern United States. We enrolled in college in record numbers. Many purchased property, churches. The Great Migration North accelerated in the 1910s as black workers quickly filled industrial jobs left vacant as the arrival of European immigrants slowed during World War I. Blacks in the North certainly had it better than those who stayed behind in the South. There, floods and boll weevils created economic disruption and hardship that left white Southerners stressed, angry, and looking for someone to blame, and blacks were the perfect scapegoats. White mobs, deprived of access to quality education and the right to vote, treated inhumanely in the justice system, and subject to demoralizing segregation in schools, accommodations, and public transportation. There was no common approach to dealing with these issues. There were many, in fact. Booker T. Washington was advocating for industrial education for blacks in an effort to achieve economic security. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, was founded in 1909. In contrast to Washington, NAACP leaders advocated not only for economic security, but civil, political, and social security. They said it demands recognition, social response, and the opportunity for new experiences in areas closed to the Negro. A third school of thought was represented by those who formed the National Urban League in 1910. It also wanted economic security for blacks, but focused on development and training, the improvement of urban conditions among Negroes in matters of health, recreation, delinquency, and crime, and for their right to participate in unions. The Negro Business League was not at all interested in assimilation or adaptation. Instead, they held that the Negro must build up a separate and distinct group economy of his own, or he will be completely crushed or forever exploited. And then there was the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History in 1915 that had as its focus unearthing the history and past accomplishments of Negroes and publishing these to build individual and group self-esteem. On top of all this, America was recovering from a devastating civil war and the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. And during the last years of Dunbar's life, Teddy Roosevelt was president and implemented sweeping new progressive reforms that changed the wage protections for workers. All of this, is the world in which Paul Laurence Dunbar was moving through time and space and writing. Can you imagine? A time of opportunity, but also one of segregation, racism, and oppression. A time of growth and expansion in the American economy and growing uncertainty in the world. So let's try to determine Dunbar's theology by looking at his poems about love, life and death, race, God, and religion. Start with love. It's always the best place to start. In 1898, Paul Laurence, fellow writer from New Orleans. By all accounts, he adored her and regularly sought her comments and feedback on his writing. She, in turn, encouraged him to write and to even quit a job that he'd been able to get at the Library of Congress so that he could focus on his writing. We see this love in poems such as "She Gave Me a Rose." She gave me a rose and I kissed it and pressed it. I love her, she knows, and my action confessed it. She gave me a rose and I kissed it. Throughout Dunbar's poetry, we see evidence of love's power to take over one's entire life and make one lose control. Love is the supreme emotion for him and can build you up or bring you down. It can raise you to the highest heights and drop you to the depths of despair. It is all-knowing, all-powerful, and transformative. And without it, one is lost. As I mentioned, Dunbar suffered from tuberculosis, and he attempted to cure it with alcohol. Eventually, because of his health and his drinking, he and his beloved Alice separated, and Dunbar returned home to Dayton, where he lived with his mother until his death. Now, on life and death, despite his health and financial woes, or maybe because of his health and financial woes and the state of the world that he lived in, his views on life were amazing to me. I noted pleasure and tension and joy and sadness and grief and sorrow in his writing. Dunbar expert Arthur Safford said, an equity of pain and pleasure, or laughter and tears. The positive and negative factors never cancel out. Interesting. Here's a poem he wrote that was called Life, or a piece of it. A crust of bread and a corner to sleep in, a minute to smile, and an hour to weep in. A pint of joy to a peck of trouble, and never a laugh but the moans come double. And that is life. That is life. Dunbar wanted to see the best in life and to experience the joy in every situation, but no doubt the hardships that he endured in his life prevented him from keeping a consistent positive outlook. It was as if real and lasting happiness was always just beyond his unfair, as evidenced in the poem The Debt. This is the debt I pay just for one riotous day, years of regret and grief, sorrow without relief. Pay it I will to the end, until the grave my friend gives me a true release, gives me the clasp of peace. Slight was the thing I bought, small was the debt I thought, poor was the loan at best, God, but the interest. One wonders whether the debt related to Dunbar's feelings about his decision to write in dialect and the criticism he received for doing so. There must have been pressure on him as a popular poet to speak on behalf of his race. Then to tell the stories of his people, of my people, but at what cost? For every voice of support, there was another one that seemed to criticize his use of language. For Dunbar, relief from the tensions and paradox of life came with death. He viewed death as a mystery which we all must face, even though we may not understand the greater meanings of life or death. In Ere Sleep Comes Down to poem mystery, which you heard earlier. In this later poem, the inevitability of death makes it easier to meet it with courage and without fear. It goes in part, when sleep comes down to seal the weary eyes, the last dear sleep whose soft embrace is balm, and whom sad sorry teaches us to prize for kissing all our passions into calm. Ah, then no more we heed the sad world's cries, or seek to probe the eternal mystery, or fret our souls at long withheld replies, at gloom through which our visions cannot see, when sleep comes down to seal the weary eyes. We move now to race, justice, and God. If you haven't noticed from these poems, there's a deep sense of faith and an awareness of the situation of the world. In fact, Dunbar wrote many poems with racial themes. As Safford notes, he followed the vogue of idealizing the antebellum plantation, of showing the kindliness of the old slave master and the loyalty of the slave to plantation pastimes in order to gain and appeal to a reasonably large reading audience. I don't know how I feel about that statement. At first glance, one wonders how there could possibly be joy in the life of an enslaved person. Yet somehow Dunbar manages to turn even these memories and stories into a testament of the ability of an enslaved person to find at least a tiny piece of joy in their otherwise miserable existence. In their otherwise miserable existence. Chicken meat and gravy too, hot and still a-heatin'. Good old sweet potato stew, Missy believes in treating. In these pieces, Dunbar calls out the humanity of the enslaved in a way that his white audiences might not even have realized was happening. Dunbar scholar Joanne Braxton writes, "It is difficult to answer the question of whether Dunbar unconsciously acquiesced to racial stereotypes. Perhaps what Dunbar attempted to do, contemporary black poet Audre Lorde, was to dismantle the master's house using the master's tools, an extremely difficult, if not impossible task." Still, there can be no doubt that Paul Laurence Dunbar was a champion of racial justice. He believed that God had sympathy for the plight of the oppressed and would support blacks in their struggle for justice and equality. On the death of Frederick Douglass, who had given Dunbar work, and "We weep for him, but we have touched his hand and felt the magic of his presence nigh. The current that he sent throughout the land, the kindling spirit of his battle cry. O'er all that holds us we shall triumph yet, and place our banner where his hope shall triumph yet, and place our banner where his hopes were set." In Dunbar's poetry, we see his belief that God's grace will be bestowed upon the oppressed. This is my second favorite poem. Oppressed. This is my second favorite poem. Not they who soar, but those who plod their rugged way unhelped to God are heroes. They who hire fare and flying fan the upper air miss all the toil, may smile upon defeated care, not they who soar. In Dunbar's mind, the dominant class may have had all the economic power and societal privilege, but God would favor those who suffered the most. God would favor those who suffered the most. Benjamin Mays writes, "Despite every crippling restriction, the black race will win through to a better day because God himself is in harmony with the Negro's upward struggle and is in it victory." Now, I'm mindful of our time this morning, and there are so many more poems I'd like to share with you, and I know that I can't. In fact, I am leaving during the postlude to go to Festival of Faith. This morning, we've had a chance to look at just a few of these poems of Paul Laurence Dunbar, a man who, in such a short life, captured the essence of the African American experience during the Reconstruction and the earliest 20th century, and managed to tell his truth. And managed to tell his truth and the truth of his people through poetry and through song. He was also a composer. But even from this cursory glance, I think you can see the depth of spirit and meaning in his work and why he is returning to our definition of theology. Can you see his poetry as religious cartography? Can you see it as a reflection of the world he lived in and how he moved through it? Once again, our nation finds itself in a time of turmoil where intolerance and divisiveness are rampant in our streets, our government, and even in our interactions with one another. How do we make meaning of our lives, especially during these troubling times? Where in the world around you do you find meaning? From books? From art? From nature? Remember, it's only through thinking, analyzing, and reassessing ourselves and the world around us that we can find the meaning in it. Only when we have truly embodied our theology, living into it and allowing it to inform our behavior and our interactions with others, can we hope to achieve the beloved community we seek.